All right, let's read the singing to lead again. We're picking up with part 3 of book 2 of chapter 5 of the life and times of Jesus the Messiah. All right, in the category of guesses, we might also place such vague statements as the Messiah would come when all were righteous or all were wicked, or else 9 months after the Empire of Rome had extended over the entire world, according to Sanhedrin 98b, or when all of the souls predestined to inhabit bodies had been on the earth. That's a different tractate. But as, after years of unrelieved sufferings, the synagogue had to acknowledge that, one by one, all of the terms had passed, and as despair settled on the heart of Israel, it came to be generally thought that the time of Messiah's advent could not be known beforehand, and that speculation on the subject was dangerous, sinful, even damnable, and that time of the end had indeed been revealed to the two sons of Adam, Jacob and David, but neither of them had been allowed to make it known. In view of this, it can be scarcely regarded as more than a symbolic, though significant guess when the future redemption of Israel is expected on the Paschal day, on the 15th of Nisan. We now approach this most difficult and delicate question. What was the expectation of the ancient synagogue as regarded the nature, the person, and the qualifications of the Messiah? In answering it, not at present from the Old Testament, but from the views expressed in the rabbinic literature, and so far as we can gather from the gospel narratives, from those cherished by the contemporaries of Christ, two inferences seem evident. First, the idea of a divine personality, and the union of the two narratives in the Messiah, seems to have been foreign to Jewish auditory as spoken by Jesus of Nazareth, and even at first to his disciples. Secondly, they appear to have regarded the Messiah as far above the ordinary human, royal, prophetic, or even angelic in type, to such extent that the boundary line separating it from a divine personality is of the narrowest, so that, when the conviction of the reality of the Messiah manifestation in Jesus burst on their minds, this boundary line was easily, almost naturally, overstepped, and those who would have shrunk from framing their belief in such a dogmatic form readily owned and worshipped him as the Son of God. Nor need we wonder at this, even taking the highest view of the Old Testament prophecy, for here also the principle applies which underlines one of St. Paul's most wide-reaching utterances, quote, "We prophesy in part," unquote. In the nature of it, all prophecy presents but disjecta membra, and it also seems as if we had to take our stand in the prophet's valley of vision, Ezekiel 37, waiting till, at the bidding of the Lord, the scattered bones should be joined into a body, to which the breath of the Spirit would then be given. These two inferences derived from the gospel narratives are in exact accordance with the whole line of ancient Jewish teaching, beginning with the Septuagint rendering Genesis 49:10, and especially Numbers 24:7 and 17. We gather that the kingdom of the Messiah was higher than that of any that was earthly, and destined to subdue them all. But the rendering of Psalm 72:5 and Psalm 110:3, and especially of Isaiah 9, carries a much farther meaning. They convey the idea that the existence of the Messiah was regarded as pre-mundane, before the moon, according to Psalm 72, before the morning star, Psalm 110, the eternal, Psalm 72, and his person and dignity as superior to that of men and angels, quote, the angel of the great council, unquote, of Isaiah 9:6, probably the angel of the face, a view fully confirmed by a rendering of the Targum. The silence of the Apocrypha about the person of the Messiah is so strange as to be scarcely explained by the consideration that those books were composed when the need for a Messiah and the deliverance of Israel was not painfully felt. All the more striking are the allusions to the pseudepigraphal writings, although these also do not carry us beyond our two inferences. Thus, the third book of the Sibylline Oracles, which, with few exceptions, dates from more than a century and a half before Christ, presents a picture of the Messianic times, generally admitted to have formed the basis of Virgil's description of a golden age, and of similar heathen expectations. These oracles, 170 years before Christ, the Messiah is, quote, the king sent from heaven, unquote, who would, quote, judge every man in blood and splendor of fire, unquote. Similarly, the vision of Messianic times opens with a reference to the king whom God will send from the sun, unquote, that a superhuman kingdom of eternal duration, such as this vision paints, should have a superhuman king seems almost a necessary corollary. Even more distinct are the statements in the so-called Book of Enoch. Critics are substantially agreed that the oldest part of it, chapters 1 through 36 and 72 through 105, dates from between 150 and 130 BC. The part next in the date is full of messianic allusions, but, as a certain class of modern writers has ascribed to it, a post-Christian date, and, however ungrounded, to Christian authorship. It may be better not to refer to it as at present as ungrounded or argument, the more so as we have other testimony from the time of Herod, not to speak, therefore, of such peculiar designations of the Messiah as, quote, the woman's son, unquote, Enoch 62:5, the Son of Man, or the elect, or the just one. The mark of Messiah is expressly designated in the oldest portion as the Son of God. I am my Son, Enoch 105:2. That all other servants of God and rule over them appears from the mystic description of the Messiah as, quote, the first of the now changed white bulls, unquote, the great animal among them, having great black horns on his head, Enoch 90:38, whom all the beasts of the field and all the fowls of heaven dread, and who they cry at all times. Still more explicit is that beautiful collection of 18 psalms dating from about half a century before Christ, which bears the name the Psalter of Solomon, a chaste anticipation of a messianic kingdom. Psalter of Solomon 11 is followed by a full description of its need and of its blessing, Psalter of Solomon 17, to which the concluding psalm, Psalm of Solomon 18, forms an apt epilogue. The king who reigns is of the house of David, Psalter of Solomon 1 or 17.5. He is the son of David, who comes at the time known to God only, to reign over Israel. He is a righteous king, taught of God. He is Christ the Lord, Psalter of Solomon 17:36, exactly as the Septuagint translates the Lamentations 4:20. He is pure from sin, which qualifies him for ruling his people and banishing sinners by his word, Psalter of Solomon 17:41. Never in his days will he be infirm towards his God, since God renders him strong with the Holy Ghost, wise in counsel, with might and righteousness, mighty in deed and word, the blessings of the Lord being upon him. He does not fail, Psalter of Solomon 17:42. This is the beauty of the King of Israel, whom God hath chosen, to set him over the house of Israel to rule it, Psalter of Solomon 17:47. Thus invincible, not by outward might, but by his God, he will bring his people the blessings of restoration to their tribal possessions, and of righteousness, but break in pieces his enemies, not by outward weapons, but by the word of his mouth. Purify Jerusalem and the judge of nations, who will be subject to his rule, and behold, and own his glory. Psalter of Solomon 17:25. Manifestly, this is not an earthly kingdom, nor yet an earthly king. So from one of these particular pseudepigraphal works that, nobody even, I never hear anybody talking about this particular work. He names two of them, the Prophecies of the Sibylline and the Psalter of Solomon and the Book of Enoch. He says that basically not only do these writings sound very, quote-unquote Christian in the way that they look at the Messiah, if you were going off of them, then everything about what Yeshua was doing would seem like, yes, oh, well, no wonder, absolutely. This is exactly what we expect the Messiah to be doing. But, of course, these were, 150 years prior to the time of Yeshua or Christ. No surprise that a lot of the probably rabbis, they would have probably known the works, known what they said, but probably would have considered them to be not of particular importance, and compared to, say, the Torah or the prophets or the older writings of rabbis from Babylon, hundreds of years prior to those writings. If we now turn to the works dating after the Christian era, we would naturally expect them either simply to reproduce earlier opinions, or from opposition to Christ, to present the Messiah in less exalted manners. But since it is strange to say, they even more strongly assert the high dignity of the Messiah, we are warranted in regarding this as the rooted belief of the synagogue. This estimate of the Messiah may be gathered from 4 Esdras, with which the kindred picture of the Messiah and his reign in the apocalypse of the Baruch, which I believe means blessing, may be compared. But even in the strictly rabbinical documents, the pre-mundane, if not the eternal existence of the Messiah, appears as a matter of common belief. Such is the view expressed in the Targum of Isaiah 9:6, and is that on Micah 5:2. But the Midrash of Proverbs 8:9 expressly mentions the Messiah among the 7 things created before the world. The passage is the more important, as it throws light on quite a series of others in which the name of the Messiah is said to have been created before the world, which goes along with the concept from John, which is that the Word was with God, the Word was God, that it is prior to. And in the Gospel of John, Yeshua says, that he was before Abraham, which gets him almost stoned. But these concepts are not unknown to Judaism. Even if this were an ideal conception, it would prove that Messiah to be elevated above the ordinary conditions of humanity. But it means much more than this, since not only the existence of Messiah long before his actual appearance, but his pre-mundane state are clearly taught in other places, in the Talmud, in Jeremiah, Bear 2:4, pages 5a. It is not only implied that the Messiah may already be among the living, but a strange story is related according to which he had actually been born in the royal palace at Bethlehem, bore the name Menachem, or Comforter, was discovered by one Judan through a peculiar device, but had been carried away by a storm. Similarly, the Babylonian Talmud represents him as sitting at the gate of imperial Rome. In general, the idea of Messiah's appearance and concealment is familiar to Jewish tradition. But the rabbis go much farther back and declare that from the time of Judah's marriage, in Genesis 38:1, God busied himself with creating the light of the Messiah. It being significantly added, before the first oppressor, that is Pharaoh, was born, the final deliverer, Messiah, the son of David, was already born. In another passage, the Messiah is expressly identified with Anani. Let's see who that is. Anani, 66. Mentioned in 1 Chronicles 3:24. The comment on this passage is curiously mystical, but clearly implies not only the pre-existence, but the superhuman characteristic of Messiah. In another passage, Messiah is expressly identified with the Anani, and therefore represented it as pre-existent long before his actual manifestation. The same inference may be drawn from his emphatic designation as the first. Lastly, in Yokot of Isaiah 60, the words, quote, "In thy light shall we see," unquote, Psalm 36:9, are explained as meaning that this is the light of the Messiah that the same which God had at first pronounced to be very good, and which before the world was created he had hid beneath the throne of his glory for the Messiah and for his age. When Satan asked for whom it might be reserved, he was told that it was destined for him who would put him to shame and destroy him. And when at his request he was shown the Messiah, he fell on his face and owned that the Messiah would in the future cast him and the Gentiles into Gehenna, Gehenna, Yakult 2. Whatever else may be inferred from it, this passage clearly implies not only the pre-existence but the pre-mundane existence of a Messiah. Excuse me. But indeed, it carries us much farther. For a Messiah pre-existent in the presence of God and destined to subdue Satan and cast him into hell could not have been regarded as an ordinary man. It is indeed true that, as the history of Elijah, so that the Messiah is throughout compared with that of Moses, the first with the last Redeemer. As Moses was educated at the court of Pharaoh, so the Messiah dwells in Rome, or Edom, among his enemies. Like Moses, he comes, withdraws, and comes again. Like Moses, he works deliverance. But here the analogy ceases, for whereas the redemption by Moses was temporary and comparatively small, the Messiah would be an eternal and absolute. All the marvels connected with Moses were to be intensified in the Messiah. The ass on which Messiah would ride, and this humble estate, was only caused by Israel's sin, Sanhedrin 98a, would be not only that on which Moses had come back to Egypt, but also that which Abraham had used when he went to offer up Isaac, and which had been specially created on the eve of the world's first Sabbath. Similarly, the horns of that ram caught in the thicket, which was offered instead of Isaac, were destined for the blowing, the left one by the Almighty on Mount Sinai, and the right, larger one by the Messiah, when he would gather the outcasts of Israel. Again, the rod of Messiah was that of Aaron which had budded, blossomed, and burst into fruit, as also that on which Jacob had leaned, and which through Judah had passed to all the kings of Israel, till the destruction of the temple. And so the principle that the latter deliverer would be like the first was carried into every detail. As the first deliverer brought down the manna, so Messiah, Psalm 72:16, as the first deliverer had made the spring of the water, so would the second. But even this is not all. That the Messiah had, without any instruction, attained the knowledge to God, and that he had received directly from him all wisdom and knowledge and counsel and grace. And it is comparatively little, since the same was claimed for Abraham, Job, and Hezekiah. But we are told that, when God showed Moses all of his successors, the spirit of wisdom and knowledge in Messiah equaled that of the others altogether. Messiah would be greater than the patriarchs, higher than Moses, and even loftier than the ministering angels. In view of this, excuse me, we can understand how the Midrash on Psalm 21:3 should apply to the Messiah in all of its literality, that God would set his own crown on his head and clothe him with his, quote, honor and majesty, unquote. It is only consistent that the same Midrash should assign to the Messiah the divine designation, Yehovah is the man of war, and Yehovah is our righteousness. One other quotation from perhaps the most spiritual Jewish commentary must be added, reminding us that of that outburst of adoring wonder which once greeted Jesus of Nazareth, the passage which refers to the 7 garments with which God successfully robed himself, the first being honor and glory at creation, Psalm 104, the second of majesty at the Red Sea, Psalm 93, the third of strength at the giving of the law, Psalm 93, the fourth, white, when he blotted out the sins of Israel, Daniel 9, Daniel 7:9, sorry. The fifth, zeal, when he avengeth them of their enemies, Isaiah 59:7. The sixth, of righteousness, at the time when the Messiah would be revealed, Isaiah 59. And the seventh, red, when he would take vengeance on Edom or Rome. But constitutes the commentary, quote, the garment with which in the future he would clothe the Messiah, its splendor will be extended from one end of the world to the other, as it is written in Isaiah 61. Quote, as a bridegroom presently in headgear, unquote. And Israel also astounded at his light, and say, blessed is the hour in which Messiah was created. Blessed the womb from which he issued. Blessed the generation that sees him. Blessed the eye that is worthy to behold him. Because the opening of his lips is a blessing and peace. His speech quieting of the spirit. Glory and majesty are in his presence, or his vesture. Confidence and tranquility in his words, and on his tongue compassion and forgiveness. His prayer is a sweet-smelling odor, and his supplication holiness and purity. Happy Israel, what is reserved for you? Thus it is written, Psalm 31:19, quote, how manifold is your goodness, which you have reserved to them that fear you. Such a king Messiah might well be represented as sitting at the right hand of God, while Abraham was only at his left, nay, as throwing forth his right hand while God stood up to war for him. It is not without hesitation that we make reference to the Jewish allusion to the miraculous birth of the Savior. Yet there are two expressions which convey the idea, if not of superhuman origin, yet of some great mystery attaching to his birth. The first occurs in connection with the birth of Seth. Rabbi Tanchuma said, in the name of Rabbi Samuel, Eve had regard, and looked forward to that seed which was to come from another place. And who is this? This is the Messiah King. The second appears in the narrative of the crime of Lot's daughter in Genesis 19:32. It is not written that we may preserve a son from our father. Is it not written that we may preserve a son from our father, but, quote, seed from our father, unquote. This is that seed which is coming from another place. And who is this? This is the King Messiah. That a superhuman character attached is not to the personality, yet to the mission of the Messiah. Perhaps from three passages is in such an expression, quote, the Spirit of the Lord moveth upon the face of the deep. And thus paraphrased, this is the Spirit of King Messiah. Wherefore this applies some activity of the Messiah in connection with creation. Or only that, from the first, his mission was to have a bearing on all creation. It elevates his character and his work above other agency among human or the angelic. And without pressing the argument, it is at least very remarkable that even the ineffable name of Yehovah is expressly attributed to the Messiah in the Midrash on the Lament 1:16. The fact becomes the more significant when we recall that one of the most familiar names of the Messiah was Anani, he who cometh in the clouds of heaven, Daniel 7:13. In what has been stated, no reference has been made to the final conquest of the Messiah, to his reign with all of its wonders, to his subdual of all nations, in short, to what are all commonly called the last things. This will be treated in another connection. Nor is it contended that, whatever individuals may have expected, the synagogue taught that the doctrine of the divine personality of the Messiah, as held by the Christian Church. On the other hand, the cumulative evidence just presented must leave on the mind at least this conviction that the Messiah expected was far above the conditions of the most exalted of God's servants, even as angels. In short, so closely bordering on the divine that it was almost impossible to distinguish him from therein. In such circumstances, it only needed the personal conviction that he who taught and wrought as none other was really the Messiah, to kindle at his word into the adoring confession that he was indeed the Son of the living God. And once that point was reached, the mind, looking back through the teachings of the synagogue, would, with ever-increasing clearness, perceive that, however ill understood it was in the past, that this had been all along the sum of the Old Testament. Thus we can understand alike the preparedness for and yet the gradualness of the conviction at this point, then the increasing clearness with which it emerges in the consciousness of the disciples, and finally the unhesitating distinctness with which it was put forth in the apostolic writings as the fundamental articles of the belief to the Church Catholic. Okay, so what he's saying is, and I know that was a lot of very, very heavy language there in those last few paragraphs. We've reached the end of the chapter now. Next time we pick up, we'll be in chapter 6 of book 2. He's basically saying that, considering all the varied, supermanish characteristics which had been applied, godlike characteristics, angelic characteristics, this, miracle worker, powerful, he can do anything, etc., type of understanding of what Messiah was going to be that had been applied to who the Messiah was going to be, is it any wonder that not only were people confused about exactly what to expect, except that they knew he would be a Superman, that they came to the conclusion, after spending time with Yeshua, after hearing him teach, after seeing the miracles that he worked, that he was the only guy who could possibly fulfill the kind of expectation that Israel actually had for its Messiah at the time. And it's such a shame, because you'll get anti-missionaries who will argue, well, there's only 7 characteristics of Messiah, and, he didn't live up to them because, the world is not at peace now after he's come, etc., etc. Yes, there were certainly those few characteristics which have been laid out by the rabbis, but there were we read about almost 1,000 others between the Torah, the Tanak, the prophets. They were nitpicking every possible miracle that would have to be fulfilled. And yes, according to what some people would say, the world is not at peace. Could it be at peace? Yes. If people would obey, yes. But the thing is, with him, they actually have the option to obey. With the Jewish religion, you only have the option of becoming a son of Noah, which are only 7 laws, the last of which is to have just courts. What does that mean? Well, we'll have to figure it out the hard way by messing with it until we figure it out. But with what Yeshua had given, he's actually asking his disciples to take it above and beyond what the scribes and Pharisees were doing. The scribes had the Torah memorized. Absolutely. So you need to have Torah memorized. Got it. The Pharisees taught the halakha and the midrash. You'll have to know the Mishnah, which is the oral Torah. You'll have to know the written Torah. You have to know the prophets. You have to know the interpretations of all these different rabbis and this understanding. He is literally asking his disciples to go above and beyond even what would have been considered a highly devout religious life at the time. Which is why we might say, well, Lord, how can we do this? How can we achieve this? Well, what did Paul tell you? He said, a man that won't work, i.e. to work in the word, will not eat. If you're not going to do the work, then you need to pay somebody to do it for you. Just like people had a rabbi that they would, work for and slave themselves to, basically. If you got to have a pastor because you're unwilling to pick up that word and study it and do the work, then get that pastor. Get it, whoever it is you need, get them. Pay them. Don't expect them to work for free. If you're unwilling to do the work, then you pay them to do the work. You want to live in the mundane world and do the mundane things, that's no problem. Take that mundane money you make and you give it to the person who's doing the spiritual work that you are unwilling to do. It's no problem. We can all grow and advance together. With that in mind, is it any surprise that there would have been so much consternation and confusion about exactly not only who Messiah was, but what to expect? I mean, there were many people who were called Messiah. You see that Gamaliel mentions it when he said, now there was one guy called Judah, and he claimed to be somebody, but he took 500 men into the wilderness, and now they're all gone. They're all dead. Romans killed them all. And then later the Bar Kokhba revolt happened where, well, I wouldn't say all, but a lot of Jews rose up against Rome, and they reclaimed Jerusalem, and they walled off the city and kept the Romans out for a time. For a time, they stood up. For a time, they were able to keep them out, but only for a time. The Empire of Rome eventually besieged and destroyed Jerusalem, and then it wasn't just taking out the temple as they'd done before. Then it was, there better not be a Jew set foot in this city or we'll kill him. And that was a lot worse than just losing the loss of the temple. Well, I guess it depends on how you look at things, but I can't speak for other people. If it was me at the time, the loss of the temple wouldn't have been as bad as the loss of the ability to go to the city of David, to go to Jerusalem, because the temple didn't have the Ark of the Covenant in it anyways. The things that would have been required to be in the temple weren't there anyways. People were doing what they could do with what they had at the time. But to lose the whole city, to lose the heart of the nation, and to be forbidden to ever set foot in it, that would be mind-blowingly difficult to deal with. Because given time, there's even rabbis who say, given time, they could have rebuilt the temple. Given time, Rome's anger would have calmed about what got the second temple destroyed. I mean, Vespasian and Titus both died horribly of internal bowel problems, which could easily have been traced back to literally the Most High God saying, you destroyed my people and my temple, I'm going to destroy you. But then again, he's the one that made him do it, right? But both of them died in very terrible ways. And then, Domitian? Anyways, the son of Titus, who came after, he also did not fare well. In fact, some would say that the book of Revelation actually describes the way in which they would die, relating it to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which actually did end up killing one of the Roman emperors, not directly, but indirectly, because he traveled to check out the damage afterwards and then ended up dying at his father's house of terrible bleeding from the bowels. Needless to say, Jehovah can wreak and strike his vengeance when he wants to, no problem. If Israel had have waited and been quiet and let the ruler assigned to rule him, which was Rome, rule over him, the third temple might have been built, shortly after the destruction of the second, within a few hundred years. But that was unable to happen because of the Bar Kokhba revolt and the labeling of a man to be Messiah, who the only type of Messiah he really ended up being was the guy who got the Jews thrown out of Jerusalem and cast out to the four corners of the earth. It really started the real diaspora that we're still recovering from today, which is beginning to be resolved because, well, there's more Jews living in Israel today than there was, any point in the last 2,000 years. The largest Jewish population was in New York City, but now it's not as large as the population of Israel. So, hey, Bo Yeshua, something's happening. Things are changing. Maybe there really is the Gulam, or the rectification really is starting to happen, and people are starting to return back to, particularly since this is the age of the internet where everything is so accessible, people are beginning to return back to maybe a pure understanding, or at least I don't want to say pure, let's say a more carefully thought out, carefully researched, and peer-reviewed understanding of what it is that God actually wants from his people and from this planet. So be blessed in Yeshua's name. And again, we've just concluded. We'll be picking up with chapter 6 next video. Had to break this one into 3 parts. So be blessed in Yeshua's name. And thank you for listening and enjoying with me.